September 24, 1942. The heart of East Prussia was cold that morning, a mist hanging low over the pine forests that surrounded Hitler's field headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. Inside, beneath layers of concrete and steel, the war's most powerful men gathered in a room that smelled of sweat, tobacco, and fear. The long oak table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the dim light of hanging lamps. Around it sat the highest officers of the Wehrmacht, men whose names commanded entire armies, men who had seen victory stretch from the French coast to the gates of Moscow. And yet, that morning, not one of them dared to breathe too loudly. At the head of the table sat Adolf Hitler. His uniform was immaculate, his movements precise, almost mechanical. The room waited for his signal to begin. But the signal never came. Instead, he looked up slowly, his eyes cold, sharp, and searching. And in that silence, a single man stepped forward. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, carried a stack of papers that weighed far more than they appeared. For years, he had been the mind behind Germany's military machine. He had planned the lightning campaigns that had shattered Europe. He had watched victory after victory unfold exactly as calculated. But what he was about to say today would undo everything. He placed the folder on the table, opened it, and began to speak. His tone was calm, professional, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. He spoke of the situation in the east, of the fighting at Stalingrad. 2 months of brutal urban warfare. Entire divisions ground to dust. Supplies thinning. The Soviets refusing to break. No one interrupted. No one dared to. Then Halder said the words that would end his career. Mein Führer, he began. We cannot take Stalingrad with the forces available. The cost in men and material will exceed any strategic value. I recommend we prepare for winter and resume offensive operations in the spring. The words hit the room like an explosion without sound. Every man present froze, their faces expressionless. Because everyone knew what Halder had just done. He had spoken truth in a place where truth was forbidden. Hitler's expression didn't change. Not at first. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. His hands tightened on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, too quiet. You recommend withdrawal? No one dared to look up. Hitler rose from his chair slowly, deliberately. His words cut through the air like the crack of a whip. You have always counseled caution, Halder. Always retreat, always hesitation. When I said we would take France, you said it was impossible, and yet I took it in 6 weeks. When I said we would conquer the East, you said it could not be done, and yet we stand at the gates of Stalingrad. And now, again, you come to me with numbers. With fear. With defeat. The tension was unbearable. Halder stood his ground. Mein Führer, I am not speaking of fear. I am speaking of reality. Reality. That word alone was enough to seal his fate. Because in that room, on that day, reality was not welcome. What Halder didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that this single confrontation would mark the turning point of the entire war. The day a general told Hitler the truth, and the day truth itself died in the Third Reich. There was a time when Franz Halder's name meant triumph. A time when Germany's war machine seemed unstoppable, when every campaign unfolded like a flawless mathematical equation, each victory proof of the nation's destiny. When Halder became chief of the General Staff in 1938, the world around him was shifting at a speed that defied logic. Within a year, German tanks were rolling through Poland, cutting through defenses with a precision the world had never seen. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had been born. Halder wasn't the kind of general who led charges from horseback or shouted commands across battlefields. He was the architect, the man behind the maps, the mind that connected supply chains to strategy, timing to terrain. His office was his battlefield, his weapon was calculation. He believed in structure, in preparation, in the power of planning over impulse. And for a time, that belief seemed justified. The campaign in Poland lasted only weeks. Then came Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and finally France, a nation thought impregnable, crushed in just 6 weeks. The French surrender at Compiègne in June 1940 seemed to confirm what Hitler had promised all along, that destiny favored the bold. Hitler, flushed with triumph, began to see himself as more than a leader. To his followers, he was now a prophet of victory. And the generals who had once advised him now merely confirmed his visions. But Halder was different. He had seen too much of war to mistake luck for destiny. Behind the glow of success, he saw cracks forming, small, subtle, but real. Logistics were stretched. Ammunition consumption exceeded expectations. Industrial output struggled to match the army's appetite. Still, the victories silenced all doubt. When Halder raised concerns, Hitler brushed them aside with theatrical confidence. Details, he'd say. The enemy has already lost, they just don't know it yet. And the truth was, in those years, he wasn't entirely wrong. From Warsaw to Paris, Hitler's instincts had triumphed over the cautious calculations of his generals. Each time Halder warned of limits, Hitler defied them, and won. The pattern was intoxicating. Victories bred arrogance, and arrogance became the empire's foundation. By 1941, when Hitler turned his gaze east toward the Soviet Union, the momentum felt unstoppable. Halder and the General Staff drafted Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers would strike in a vast arc across the Soviet frontier. The plan was bold, brutal, and logistically impossible. Halder knew the risks. He knew the distances, the supply problems, the unpredictable Russian terrain. He knew it wasn't a 6-week war like France. It was something else entirely. But he also knew that opposing the Führer had become dangerous. The General Staff no longer debated, they obeyed. The machinery of command had transformed from a system of strategy into a hierarchy of faith. And for a while, even faith seemed to work. In the summer of 1941, the German advance tore through Soviet lines. Entire armies were surrounded and annihilated. By October, German troops were within sight of Moscow. Halder recorded in his diary that victory seemed near. But the optimism didn't last. The weather turned. The roads dissolved into mud. Fuel froze in engines. Soviet resistance hardened. The front stopped moving, and then, slowly, began to fall apart. It was during those months that Halder began to understand something chilling. The same boldness that had won Hitler his empire was now leading him toward destruction. By the summer of 1942, Hitler's eyes were fixed on a single city, Stalingrad. He called it the key to victory, the gate to the Caucasus, the symbol that would break the Soviet spirit. But Halder saw something else. He saw an obsession, a hunger for prestige that defied strategy. He calculated the numbers, the distances, the tonnage of fuel, ammunition, and food required to sustain the offensive. The equations didn't balance. The war machine that once moved like lightning was now dragging itself through exhaustion. And yet, Hitler refused to listen. Every victory had confirmed his belief that willpower could rewrite reality. Every warning from his generals had been proven wrong, or so he thought. For Halder, that was the true tragedy. Because he had helped build the very system that now refused to hear him. He had crafted the tools of conquest, and in doing so, had armed the delusion that would destroy them all. What began as triumph had turned into faith. And faith, Halder knew, was a poor substitute for truth. By August 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had devoured everything, men, machines, and reason itself. The German army, once a precise instrument of conquest, was now bleeding out across thousands of miles of open steppe. And at the center of this storm stood one word that consumed every conversation, every calculation, every order: Stalingrad. The city stretched along the Volga River, a jagged scar of factories, smoke, and ruin. It wasn't just another objective on the map. To Hitler, it was a symbol, a name that carried the weight of pride, revenge, and destiny. To capture a city named after Stalin himself was more than victory. It was psychological domination. But to Halder, it was madness disguised as strategy. He studied the reports arriving from the front. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was locked in a nightmare, house-to-house combat, where every building had to be conquered twice, once from the Soviets, and once again after the counterattack. Entire companies were being erased from existence in a single day. The progress, if it could be called that, was measured in meters. Streets changed hands so many times they stopped being named. The city had become a graveyard built on rubble. And yet, the orders from Berlin never changed. Advance. Hold. No retreat. Asterisk. Every night, Halder received casualty reports that read like obituaries for entire divisions. He calculated that since August, more than 80,000 men had been lost, killed, wounded, or missing. The supply lines, already stretched thin, were collapsing. The army needed 700 tons of supplies per day. Even on good days, only 300 arrived. Fuel ran low. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Winter clothing was almost non-existent. And across the Volga, the Soviets, battered but unbroken, were moving reinforcements every night, ferried by small boats under cover of darkness. Each new report was a warning written in blood. Halder compiled them, analyzed them, tried to make sense of the chaos. But the numbers told only one story: the offensive was unsustainable. The deeper the army pushed into the ruins, the more vulnerable it became. The flanks, held by Romanian and Italian troops, were dangerously exposed. It wasn't just a tactical concern, it was a death sentence waiting to be signed. In his private notes, Halder wrote, "The Führer does not see the limits of our strength. Every kilometer gained costs us an army. Every street taken demands a month of resupply we cannot afford." He knew the Sixth Army was marching into a trap, one that geography, logistics, and sheer mathematics had already drawn. But in the world Hitler had created, numbers no longer mattered. Only faith did. In Berlin, maps were filled with colored pins and arrows showing victory. In reality, the soldiers were starving for rations, burning scrap wood for warmth, fighting over shattered bricks. Reports from the front describing exhaustion and shortages were edited before they reached Hitler's desk. Bad news was rephrased, softened, made to sound temporary. The truth was being filtered, reshaped, hidden. Halder understood what that meant. The same disease that had infected the Reich's politics was now consuming its military. Loyalty had become more important than accuracy. Optimism had become a requirement. And realism was treason. He spent hours rewriting his briefing for Hitler, trying to find words that could pierce the fog of delusion without ending his career. But deep down, he knew it was impossible. There were no safe words left. When truth itself is dangerous, even silence becomes a form of rebellion. And so, on that September morning, Halder decided to do the unthinkable. He would tell the Führer the truth, in front of everyone. He would describe the situation exactly as it was: the casualties, the broken supply lines, the impossible demands. He would speak as a soldier, not a believer. He knew it would end badly. He knew what had happened to those who contradicted Hitler before him. But to remain silent, he believed, would be worse. He wasn't trying to save himself anymore. He was trying to save the army. And so, as he prepared for that fateful meeting, Halder wrote one final note in his diary. "There is no victory in ignoring reality. There is only delay before collapse." He closed the notebook, straightened his uniform, and left for the conference room. Outside, the autumn wind tore through the trees. Inside, Truth was about to walk into a room where truth no longer existed. September 24, 1942. The conference room deep inside the wolf's lair felt like a tomb. Heavy drapes sealed out the gray daylight. The air was thick with the smoke of cigarettes and the smell of damp uniforms. Around the massive oak table, the men of the Wehrmacht sat in perfect stillness, field marshals, generals, aides, all waiting. The clock ticked softly. The only sound in the room. At the far end, the door opened. General Franz Halder stepped in, his expression calm but his eyes shadowed by fatigue. In his hands, a folder, filled with numbers, reports, and facts that had become too dangerous to say aloud. He walked to the head of the table, bowed slightly, and began. "Mein Führer," he said quietly, "I will present the situation on the Eastern Front." Hitler gave a small nod. His face was unreadable. Halder's voice was steady as he began listing the figures: casualties in the tens of thousands, supply convoys ambushed, fuel depots destroyed, divisions fighting at half strength. He spoke of the Soviet reinforcements crossing the Volga every night, of the frost already creeping into the steppe, of the roads turning into rivers of mud. Then he paused. The room held its breath. He looked directly at Hitler and said, "Mein Führer, the Sixth Army cannot take Stalingrad with the forces available. The losses will exceed any possible benefit. I recommend we fortify our current lines, prepare for the winter, and resume operations when we are resupplied." A silence fell so complete that even the clock seemed to stop. Every officer in the room knew what those words meant. Halder had done the unthinkable. He had told Hitler, no. Hitler didn't move. For a moment, his face was blank, then a slow flush crept up his neck. His hands clenched into fists on the table. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes were burning. "You recommend withdrawal?" It wasn't a question. "You, who opposed the attack on France. You, who doubted the invasion of the Soviet Union. Every victory I have achieved, you called impossible. And now again you speak of limits. Of fear. Of mathematics." Halder didn't flinch. He took a breath and replied, "Mein Führer, this is not fear. It is reality. Our supply lines extend over 700 kilometers. The army needs 700 tons of supplies daily. We deliver perhaps 300, and that on good days. The Soviets are not collapsing. They are preparing." Hitler slammed his palm against the table. "Mathematics. Always mathematics and caution. Did mathematics conquer France in 6 weeks? Did caution bring us to the Volga? No. Victory comes from will, from faith." The officers around the table sat motionless, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood before them. No one dared to look up. Halder's tone hardened. "With respect, Mein Führer, will does not move fuel, and faith cannot replace ammunition. The army is fighting beyond its means." The words struck like blows. Hitler's breathing grew faster. His voice dropped into a low snarl. "You see obstacles where others see opportunity. You poison my army with hesitation. You are surrounded by defeatists, and you are their leader." He turned sharply toward Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, his loyal enforcer. "Enough. I am surrounded by cowards and clerks. Halder is relieved of his duties as Chief of the General Staff, effective immediately. Replace him with Zeitzler, someone who believes in victory." The words hung in the air like the sound of a gunshot. Halder stood perfectly still. He knew it was over. Slowly, he removed the insignia from his collar and placed them on the table. "Jawohl, Mein Führer." He saluted, turned, and walked out. No one in that room moved. No one spoke. The door closed with a quiet click that sounded louder than the explosion of artillery. Inside, the men of the Wehrmacht stared at the empty doorway, each one silently thanking God it hadn't been them. Halder walked down the dim hallway toward the cold September air. The moment he stepped outside, he felt the weight of it lift, replaced by something colder, the realization that the war, from this moment on, was lost. Because inside that room, truth had just been executed. When Franz Halder left the conference room that morning, he knew exactly what he had done. He hadn't simply lost his position, he had crossed an invisible line, one that no officer in Hitler's empire was ever meant to cross. He had told the truth. Outside, the air was cold and still. The trees surrounding the wolf's lair whispered in the wind, and for the first time in years, Halder felt something like peace, the grim, empty kind that comes when the worst has already happened. Inside, the silence that followed his departure was suffocating. The men around the oak table sat perfectly still, avoiding each other's eyes. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe too deeply. Because everyone understood what that moment meant. A general had been destroyed for speaking the truth. Hitler didn't rage immediately. He just stared at the door through which Halder had left, his expression blank, his fingers tapping on the table in slow, rhythmic beats. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, too calm. "Weakness," he said softly, almost to himself. "Always weakness. Surrounded by men who think in limits and not in destiny." He turned to Keitel. "Draft the order. Halder is relieved of his duties, effective immediately. He will be replaced by General Kurt Zeitzler. A younger man. A believer." Keitel nodded. No one else moved. For the rest of that day, the headquarters operated in uneasy silence. Word of Halder's dismissal spread quickly, not through official channels, but in whispers. "Halder's gone." "What happened?" He contradicted the Führer. And that was all anyone needed to hear. Every officer understood the message instantly. It wasn't about Halder anymore. It was about them. From that moment forward, disagreement was death. The men who had once debated strategy, who had spent their careers studying maps and supply lines, now learned to nod, to say yes even when the truth screamed no. They had seen what honesty cost. They would not pay the same price. In the weeks that followed, Halder's office was emptied, his name removed from reports. Officially, his departure was described as a reassignment. Unofficially, it was an excommunication. Halder himself was ordered into retirement. He packed his belongings in silence, under the watchful eyes of staff officers who spoke to him only in clipped phrases. There were no farewells, no handshakes. Only the quiet scraping of drawers being closed and papers being burned. He returned to his home near Munich, not as a hero, not even as a soldier, but as a man already erased from the history being written around him. But for Hitler, the day's victory wasn't over. That night, he met privately with his inner circle, Keitel, Jodl, Zeitzler, and Goebbels. The meeting was brief but symbolic. "We no longer need men who see only problems," Hitler declared. "We need fighters. Believers. The war will not be won by mathematics, but by faith." Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. No one believed. Because in their hearts, they knew what Halder had known. The Eastern Front was collapsing from exhaustion, and no amount of faith could feed an army that had nothing left to eat. But none of them said it. The army that had once been a machine of discipline and logic had become something else, a reflection of one man's will. And when that will turned blind, the machine followed it into darkness. Back in Bavaria, Halder began writing in his diary again, page after page filled with numbers, notes, and observations. He wasn't writing for glory or revenge. He was recording reality, because he knew no one else would. In one entry he wrote, "The truth has become a weapon turned against the one who speaks it. Those who flatter survive. Those who calculate die." He wasn't exaggerating. Within days of his dismissal, senior officers began altering their reports. Casualty figures were softened, supply shortages downplayed. Commanders in the field learned to replace the word retreat with repositioning. The army was learning a new language, one built on denial. And so, while the trains rolled east carrying more men and more weapons towards Stalingrad, no one dared to remind the Führer that winter was coming. No one dared to repeat Halder's warning. The cost of honesty had been made clear. And it would be paid again, in blood. 8 weeks later, the truth Halder had spoken would roar back in fire and steel. The counterattack he predicted was already gathering strength beyond the horizon. And when it came, it would not only destroy the Sixth Army, it would shatter the illusion of invincibility that Hitler had built. But by then, it would be too late. Too late for Halder, too late for the soldiers in Stalingrad, too late for Germany. The truth had been spoken once. No one had listened. Now, reality was coming to make itself heard. November 19, 1942. The frozen dawn over the steppes of southern Russia began with a sound that shook the earth, a thunder that rolled endlessly, swallowing the horizon. Artillery. Thousands of Soviet guns opening fire at once. For hours, the ground itself seemed to tremble as wave after wave of shells screamed through the air, tearing through snow and steel and men alike. The Romanian lines north of Stalingrad, thin, under-equipped, already exhausted, were obliterated. By noon, The Red Army's tanks were pouring through the gaps. The trap had sprung. The prophecy Halder had spoken 8 weeks earlier was coming true with merciless precision. The Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, struck not the heart of Stalingrad but its flanks, exactly where Halder had said the Germans were weakest. The Romanian and Italian divisions, armed with outdated weapons and little anti-tank support, simply shattered under the onslaught. By November 23, the nightmare was complete. 2 great Soviet forces, one from the north, one from the south, met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The jaws of the trap closed. Inside the encirclement were more than 280,000 men, the entire German Sixth Army, cut off, surrounded, and trapped in the city Hitler had declared must be taken at any cost. At first, the orders from Berlin were simple: *hold your positions. The Führer will not abandon you. Hitler promised that supplies would arrive by air, that the Luftwaffe would sustain the army until reinforcements broke through. But the reality was far darker. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies each day: food, fuel, ammunition, medicine. The Luftwaffe could deliver maybe 100. On some days, even less. Pilots flew through blizzards and anti-aircraft fire, only to drop crates into the snow miles from their targets. Fuel froze in barrels. Bread turned to stone. Wounded men lay in cellars without morphine, shivering to death beside empty stoves. Inside the city, soldiers began to starve. Horses were slaughtered first, then dogs, then anything that moved. Men boiled leather belts to make soup. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Rifles jammed, oil solidified, vehicles froze where they stood. Still, the orders came: hold Stalingrad. General Paulus, trapped inside the ruins, sent desperate messages to Hitler's headquarters. The situation is critical. The troops can no longer fight effectively. We request permission to attempt breakout. The answer came swiftly. The Sixth Army will hold its ground. Relief forces are on the way. But there were no relief forces capable of breaking through. Field Marshal Manstein's attempt to reach Stalingrad faltered in the snow and Soviet fire. Their relief never came. By Christmas, the Sixth Army was collapsing. Soldiers were dying where they stood, too weak to move, too cold to bury their dead. Entire companies disappeared into the snow without a sound. The radio operators, still loyal to duty, continued to transmit reports, their voices growing weaker with each day. One message simply read: no food. No ammunition. Situation hopeless. Still fighting. Halder, now in forced retirement hundreds of miles away, listened to the reports with silent horror. Everything he had warned about, every calculation, every number, every word, was unfolding exactly as predicted. The encirclement, the supply crisis, the winter, the collapse of morale, all of it had come true. He had spoken the truth, and it had been ignored. Now that truth had turned into death. By January 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Men too weak to lift their weapons were captured in the ruins they'd been ordered to defend. Others wandered through the wreckage, delirious from hunger and cold. On February 2nd, the last German positions surrendered. Of the 280,000 men trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket, 91,000 survived to surrender. Only about 6,000 would ever return home. The rest vanished, into the snow, into Soviet captivity, into history. Hitler received the news in his headquarters with an eerie calm. He didn't rage, didn't weep, didn't apologize. He simply declared, "The army has done its duty." Then he blamed the generals, the same ones who had followed his every order, for lacking the will to win. For Halder, it was confirmation of everything he had feared. In his diary, he wrote one final note on the tragedy. Mathematics does not care for faith. The numbers do not bend to the will of men. They only wait to be proven right. The truth had spoken through numbers, through logic, through reason. But no one had listened until it came in the form of silence. The silence of 280,000 men who would never speak again. Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was the moment Germany's illusion of invincibility died, and with it, the empire itself began to crumble. And yet, even then, inside his bunker, Hitler still believed the war could be won by sheer will. The same delusion that silenced Franz Halder had now consumed an entire nation. The surrender at Stalingrad didn't just destroy an army, it destroyed something deeper inside Germany. It shattered the illusion that faith alone could conquer the laws of reality. And yet, inside Hitler's headquarters, no one said it aloud. No one dared to. When the reports arrived, the last transmissions from the Sixth Army, they were quietly filed away, rewritten, and sanitized before being read to Hitler. The disaster was not called a defeat. It was called a temporary setback. The encirclement wasn't failure, it was heroic endurance. Truth had died, and propaganda took its place. Those who survived Stalingrad and returned to Germany months or years later were treated not as witnesses, but as ghosts. The official line was simple: the army had done its duty, but had been betrayed by fate, by weather, by bad luck, anything but leadership. Inside the general staff, a new ritual replaced strategy. Officers no longer debated. They performed. They stood before Hitler with carefully edited reports and exaggerated optimism. Every setback was under control. Every loss was part of the plan. The machinery of war had become a theater, and every man in uniform was now an actor reciting lines written by fear. Generals learned quickly. Those who told Hitler what he wanted to hear were rewarded. Those who didn't disappeared. In a single year, more than a dozen senior commanders were dismissed, reassigned, or quietly retired. Some were sent to obscure posts. Others were arrested. A few simply vanished. And yet, inside the barracks, the soldiers kept dying the same way, hungry, frozen, forgotten. Franz Halder, from his forced retirement, watched it unfold with grim recognition. He read the official bulletins, the triumphant speeches, the endless declarations of forthcoming victory, and knew they were lies, lies told not just to the German people, but to the men fighting and dying on the front. In his private writings he described the new Germany as asterisk, a state at war not with the enemy, but with reality itself. Asterisk. He was right. By 1943, the Nazi command structure had become a closed circle. Information no longer traveled upward, it was filtered, altered, and softened at every level. Field reports from the Eastern Front were rewritten to sound hopeful before they reached Berlin. Casualty numbers were reduced. Requests for retreat were rephrased as tactical repositioning. Each officer down the chain learned the same lesson: tell the truth and you die, lie, and you live. The consequences were catastrophic. Hitler's decisions were no longer based on reality. They were based on a fantasy drawn on maps. Entire divisions that had been wiped out were still listed as active. Fuel that didn't exist was assumed available. Reinforcements that had never been trained were counted as ready for battle. And because no one dared to challenge him, Hitler believed it all. He spent hours each night hunched over maps, moving colored pins that represented units that no longer existed. He gave orders to phantom divisions, demanded offensives with supplies that were gone, and punished generals for cowardice, when physics, not fear, made their missions impossible. To his followers, this was genius. To men like Halder, it was insanity, and worse, it was contagious. The culture of fear that began with one dismissal now infected every level of command. Even Field Marshal Manstein, perhaps Germany's greatest strategist, learned to phrase his advice carefully: not retreat, but flexible defense; not failure, but reorganization. Truth had to be smuggled in under false names. By 1944, the army was no longer fighting just the Allies. It was fighting its own delusions. Reports from the front were meaningless. Orders from Berlin were impossible. And between them lay a silence filled with millions of lives being wasted in battles that could not be won. Halder, in his solitude, understood the pattern perfectly. He wrote, "In the Führer's world, truth is treason and loyalty is survival. And when truth becomes treason, defeat becomes inevitable. It was the same disease that had killed the Sixth Army, spreading now through the entire Reich, unseen but deadly. A nation that punished its truth-tellers had become blind. A leader who silenced his realists had surrounded himself with echoes. And a war that could have ended sooner dragged on into total destruction. By the time Hitler realized he had been deceived, there was nothing left to save. The truth hadn't just died, it had been buried beneath the ruins of Stalingrad, beneath the ashes of cities, beneath the weight of obedience. It was gone. And in its place stood only silence, the kind that comes when no one dares to speak anymore. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echoes of what had happened long before that day never truly faded. Germany lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its armies gone, its leader dead in a bunker beneath a city of ash. Yet the real destruction had begun years earlier, in that small conference room in East Prussia, when one man dared to speak the truth, and was silenced for it. The fall of the Third Reich wasn't sudden. It was slow, methodical, inevitable, the death of logic, one truth at a time. Every dismissal, every lie, every false report built the walls of a prison made of obedience. And by the time those walls closed in, there was no one left inside with the courage to break them. Franz Halder watched it happen from afar. After his dismissal, he lived in forced isolation, first under surveillance, later under house arrest. He had no command, no influence, no voice. But his mind never stopped working. Every day, he wrote, pages upon pages of diaries, calculations, and reflections. Not for Hitler. Not for the army. But for the truth itself. When the war ended, Halder was arrested by the Americans. They saw in him not an enemy, but a key, a witness who could explain how a professional army had become the servant of a dictator's fantasy. In interrogation rooms and historical briefings, he told the story exactly as it had happened. He described how officers had stopped thinking, how fear replaced strategy, how lies replaced facts. He told them that the greatest defeat of Germany wasn't at Stalingrad or Normandy or Berlin. It was the moment its leaders decided that truth was dangerous. The Americans released him. He became an advisor for post-war historians, helping them reconstruct what had gone wrong. And though his name faded from the headlines, his diaries became essential, a map of how truth dies when no one protects it. In the years that followed, scholars and soldiers alike studied his notes. They found not just military analysis, but warnings, the kind that echo far beyond one war or one generation. Halder wrote that the greatest threat to any army, any government, any institution, is not defeat in battle, but the refusal to recognize reality. He had seen what happens when leaders surround themselves with believers instead of thinkers, when loyalty outweighs honesty, when saying yes becomes more important than being right. He had lived through it, and he had paid for it. And yet, he survived long enough to see the truth restored. In post-war Germany, as historians pieced together the fragments of the past, Halder's predictions, once dismissed as pessimism, were proven painfully accurate. Everything he had warned about had come true, not because he was prophetic, but because he had looked at the facts without fear. By the 1960s, his name returned to the pages of history, not as a hero, but as a reminder. A reminder of what happens when truth becomes treason. He lived until 1972, old and quiet, in a country that had finally rebuilt itself from the ruins he had foreseen. And in his final years he often told visitors the same simple thing. It wasn't that we didn't know. It was that we didn't want to know. He wasn't speaking only of the war. He was speaking of a human truth, one that outlives empires. Because history is full of Halder's warnings, repeated in new languages and new uniforms. Leaders who silence dissent. Advisors who hide bad news. Nations that choose comfort over truth. The pattern never changes, only the names do. And each time it happens, the same result follows. The lies grow louder, the truth grows smaller, and disaster comes wearing the mask of destiny. Halder's story, buried in old war diaries, is more than a military lesson. It's a mirror, one that reflects not just the past, but the present and the future. Because the death of truth doesn't announce itself with gunfire or headlines. It begins quietly, with a silence in a room full of men who know better, but say nothing. That silence, once it starts, can bring down empires. And on September 24, 1942, inside that silent room in East Prussia, the first echo of collapse began. September 24, 1942, the day a German general told the truth, and the day an empire sealed its fate. It began in silence, a quiet room in East Prussia, a conversation between a soldier and a dictator. But what happened there would echo through the rest of the war, through every defeat, every loss, every ruin that followed. Franz Halder didn't fall because he was wrong. He fell because he was right too soon. He had seen the truth written not in ideology or hope, but in numbers, cold, merciless numbers that didn't care for politics or pride. He warned that the army was stretched too thin, that supplies would fail, that the Soviets would strike back, that winter would finish what arrogance had begun. And he was right. Every word, every calculation, every grim prediction came true, not because fate was cruel, but because no one was allowed to listen. When Halder was dismissed, something far greater than one man's career ended that day. What died in that room was the last voice of reason within a system that could no longer tell the difference between faith and fantasy. From that moment on, truth itself became an enemy of the Reich. And when truth becomes treason, defeat is no longer a possibility, it's a certainty waiting for its hour. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just a military disaster. It was the physical manifestation of a moral one, the price a nation pays when it chooses loyalty over honesty, and silence over courage. In the years that followed, Hitler continued to fight his war not against his enemies, but against reality itself. He trusted his instincts over evidence, punished facts as betrayal, and surrounded himself with men who nodded instead of thought. By the time the walls of Berlin fell, those same men stood in the rubble of their own obedience. Franz Halder lived long enough to see it all. He saw Germany fall, and then rise again, this time not through faith, but through truth. He saw historians uncover the diaries he had written in isolation, and realized that his words had outlived the empire that silenced him. In one of his last writings, he reflected on the cost of truth. To speak honestly is dangerous, but to stay silent is fatal. It was a lesson written in blood, carved into the snows of Stalingrad, and echoed through generations. Because what destroyed the German army was not the Soviet winter, nor the enemy's strength, it was the death of truth inside its own walls. The moment a leader decides that reality must obey him, he is already defeated. The moment those around him learn to agree instead of advise, the collapse has already begun. September 24, 1942, was not just the day Franz Halder lost his command. It was the day truth itself was dismissed from the German army. And when truth left the room, defeat walked in quietly and took its place. The city of Stalingrad would fall, but not as Hitler imagined. It would fall into legend, not as a victory, but as a warning. A warning that no matter how powerful a nation becomes, no matter how invincible a leader believes himself to be, reality will always have the final word. And it speaks only one language, truth.